Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is The Current Podcast.
The fentanyl crisis in Canada is well documented. Canada's Public Health Agency estimates nearly 45,000 people have died of toxic drug overdoses since 2016. Last year, 4 out of 5 of those deaths involved fentanyl. What may surprise you, where the drug is coming from. Criminal organizations have gone from importing the fentanyl to making it here in Canada.
I've encountered laboratories in rural areas hidden inside shipping containers or sea crates. We've discovered laboratories in residential homes, in rural properties. So it really depends on what the end goal of the drug trafficker is.
That was Hamilton Police Detective Matthew Dugdale. Last August, police in Hamilton, Ontario, took down 2 superlabs they say were producing hundreds of kilograms of fentanyl, and there have been increasing numbers of lab busts across the country. CBC reporter Darren Major has been talking to law enforcement agencies about this shift. Good morning.
Good morning.
You recently obtained briefing notes that were prepared for the Deputy Health Minister about fentanyl. Tell us what you learned about the amount of illicit fentanyl being produced here in the country.
Yeah, so the briefing note says that the amount of fentanyl that's being produced in Canada is more than sufficient. That's an actual quote. More than sufficient to meet domestic market demand. In fact, there seems to be some suggestions that we have an oversupply of Canadian-produced fentanyl in Canada. Detective Dugdale, who you played a clip of off the top there, he suggested to me that he's anecdotally seen the price of fentanyl in Hamilton anyway drop recently as much as 30%, which is an indication that we might be at an oversupply of fentanyl made in Canada. And
when did this shift start? When did we go from importing this drug to making it here at home?
So prior to 2019, we primarily imported fentanyl from China. In May of 2019, though, the Chinese government increased regulations around the export and production of fentanyl. So that started the shift, but it seems to have just accelerated during the pandemic. One of the things that Detective Dugdale told me was that we can all kind of remember how things were at the start of the pandemic. You know, it was hard enough to import something that was legal, so it was really that much harder to import something that was illegal. So again, the pandemic just kind of accelerated that shift.
And necessity is the mother of invention.
Exactly.
So tell me about what police have found regarding these drug labs. How sophisticated are they?
Seems to me a bit of a mixed bag. One of the RCMP officers I spoke to said this isn't something that a chemistry high school student could just set up at home. This requires a lot of investment into the equipment, which again kind of speaks to the profitability that organized crime groups are getting from the fentanyl trade.
Where do they get the chemicals to actually produce the fentanyl?
Yeah, so that kind of seems to be where part of the shift happened. Like prior to 2019, a lot of the fentanyl, like I said, was coming in from China. Now it seems that a lot of the precursor chemicals, which are used to make fentanyl, are now being imported from China. Now, some of them can be legally purchased in Canada as well, but primarily it seems to be coming from China. And a lot of them are perfectly legal and can be procured using common methods of payment. So it makes it a bit difficult for police to track in that sense. Health Canada is starting to regulate a lot of these precursors, but there's still a few challenges in that regard.
Let's just play a little bit more of your interview with Detective Matthew Dugdale from the Hamilton Police Department, from the Drugs and Gangs Unit.
One of the dangers that we see a lot in the drug unit especially is that when these laboratories are producing a synthetic opioid like fentanyl, obviously because they are clandestine in nature, the quality control is not really at the forefront of these drug traffickers' minds. So the problem becomes when they alter a recipe or somewhere during the manufacturing process of the drug, they might be intending to make it a fentanyl that they've done incorrectly. They end up producing an analog of fentanyl. And one of the most dangerous analogs of fentanyl that we see in the city of Hamilton is carfentanil, which is already 100 times stronger than regular fentanyl, which in and of itself is already 100 times stronger than morphine.
Darren, what kind of a risk to public safety do these labs and this made in Canada phenomena pose?
So there's a few risks that law enforcement seem to be concerned about. One, if there is an oversupply on the market and indeed the price is dropping, there's a risk that we're now seeing like a flood of cheaper fentanyl on the streets, which can increase the risk of overdoses. Second part of that is if labs are operating in Canada, and some of them potentially in urban areas, that poses like a risk of fire, like there's safety hazards in that regard, as well as the production of fentanyl actually can cause like some like a chemical byproduct, which can be a risk if not handled properly.
So we're making more of this product in Canada, which I'm assuming means there's more of it on the streets, and you already hinted that this is driving down the price?
There's starting to be evidence that Canadian-made fentanyl is actually making its ways overseas. So we're potentially an exporter of fentanyl now. There's certain evidence of that in the United States. I think the U.S. over the last 5 years has intercepted probably about 25 kilos of Canadian-made fentanyl coming south into the U.S. That really pales in comparison to the numbers of interceptions they catch coming from Mexico on their southern border, but it's still happening. The RCMP officer I spoke to said that it seems to be fairly small scale in that regard, like it's individual sellers kind of operating on the dark web and probably moving their product via the mail. The fentanyl is easy to conceal, so it could just simply be shipped by mail in some regards. But we're also seeing it show up in countries overseas. They found about 11 kilos of fentanyl hidden in, I think it was some wooden furniture. And at the time, it was the biggest bust of opioids trying to make its way into Australia. And they believe it came from Canada.
Does Canadian law enforcement have the resources, the skills, what they need to be able to cope with this growing threat?
The main challenges right now is around precursors.
The ingredients that are necessary to make the product.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, some of these are perfectly legal and can be purchased. They are regulated, a lot of them, but one of the concerns is that organized crime are starting to get a bit smarter about breaking them down. So what they'll do is they'll take a precursor, break it down into, a pre-precursor, and then move it that way. And then that's easier to evade detection because these precursors are not necessarily regulated. Health Canada says they are starting to move proactively on that. There's a set of precursors or pre-precursors that are set to be regulated starting in September. But that's one thing that, like I said, it feels like law enforcement and regulations are trying to keep up with. Another issue is we're now producing this on Canadian soil. It kind of removes that layer of the border, whereas like border detection was prior to 2019, 2020 was an extra layer of security that is now removed because it's being produced right here in Canada.
So lots of catch-up happening. It's really good to talk to you about this. Nice work on this story, Darren.
Thank you.
Darren Major is a CBC reporter in Ottawa. Vonda Felbab-Brown is a senior fellow in the Strobe Talbot Centre for Security, Strategy and Technology at the Brookings Institution. She studies the global fentanyl trade. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on the show.
We're glad to have you and your expertise on this subject. What do you make of Canada's shift from importing fentanyl to producing it here at home?
Well, the shift that was reported, that namely after China started regulating the entire class of fentanyl-type drugs in May 2019, traffickers switched to moving precursors, is in fact the same story that happened in the United States. So prior to 2019, fentanyl is shipped in a finished form from China to the United States and in the same way to Canada. After 2019 and through 2020, the shift that occurs is that production locates elsewhere, closer to the retail market. But there are fascinating differences between the United States and Canada. In the U.S. story, the production overwhelmingly locates in Mexico. Chinese trafficking groups sell precursor chemicals to Mexican cartels, the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. They synthesize fentanyl there and then bring it across the U.S.-Mexico border to the United States. And this is the dominant, overwhelming picture that we are seeing in the U.S. since late 2019. The fascinating difference in Canada is that production is taking place in Canada itself and does not so far entail Mexican criminal groups. It's much smaller Canadian groups that are then using biker groups like Hell's Angel to be the distributors.
I'm wondering, when I listen to you describe this, what the Mexican drug cartels would think of Canada getting in on this game. That are they potentially, is Canada criminal organizations potentially threatening some Mexican business?
Well, eventually they could. So we did not have a situation prior to 2019 where the Mexican cartels were the principal distributors. The principal distributors were trafficking actors, networks in China. But the Mexican cartels, Sinaloa and Jalisco, are very ambitious. They have been expanding globally. They dominate criminal activity south of the U.S. border across the Americas all the way to Chile. They have only one or two significant competitors in the Southern Cone. They are expanding their operations into Asia Pacific, Australia, and New Zealand. You heard about the fentanyl bust in 2021 in Australia. And they are expanding their operations in Europe. So it's certainly possible that at some point they would decide that the U.S.-Canada border is no longer a border that interests them and that they could start bringing fentanyl into Canada. In fact, what we see so far is that the Mexican cartels are using Canadian criminal groups like the Hells Angels to help them move methamphetamine into Canada and through Canada to Asia.
I was just about to ask you where the Mexican cartels are actually getting their chemicals. So are they, in some cases, getting their chemicals from here in Canada?
Well, no, we haven't heard that. Most of the chemicals are really coming to Mexico from China. There is also much smaller supply of precursor chemicals from India to Mexico, as well as from India to Europe. But what's happening with meth is that the Mexicans are using Canadian groups to move finished meth to the Asia region or to Canada.
So is that an emerging partnership that authorities should be worried about?
Yeah, so far it is. I mean, it's fascinating to look at the speed with which criminal groups, potent international criminal groups, expand internationally. And the Mexican groups could have made a much larger presence in Canada for some years now. They have been slowly growing there. Their presence in Canada has been increasing over the past 5-6 years. It started before COVID, but it's largely been quite quiet, low, and it hasn't resulted in any violence, and it's more resulted in partnerships. That might not stay that way forever. The two cartels, Sinaloa and Jalisco, are often very aggressive and demand very exclusionary vassal relationships from local criminal groups. They, however, make choices how they behave. In places like United States, like Canada, like Europe, where you have potent and effective law enforcement with strong deterrence capacity, they tend to behave far more peacefully and engage in minimal violence, unlike in Mexico or elsewhere in Latin America, where they're willing to set off violence on par with a war zone, and their violence is often extraordinarily brazen.
What has the Mexican government done to crack down on fentanyl production?
Well, very little. And more importantly, it has done very little to crack down on the Mexican criminal groups, even though they threaten not just public health in the United States, but they threaten basic security in Mexico and south of Mexico. The López Obrador administration that has been in power over the past 6 years and finishes this fall took office with the notion that it would back away from law enforcement against the criminal groups. It subscribed to the notion that earlier effort to confront the cartels, such as during the Felipe Calderón administration between 2006 and 2012, these efforts blew up the criminal markets, that there was so much violence in Mexico, 30,000 dead per 100,000 every year, that if only law enforcement backed away, the criminals would solve it out among themselves and violence would subside. that overwhelmingly did not happen in Mexico. Violence is still extraordinarily high. It is still over 30,000 people dead a year. And instead, what happened with this hands-off law enforcement approach was that the criminal groups expanded vastly their territorial control, and they take over of legal economies, institutions, territories, and people in Mexico. Now, the United States has been pressuring the Mexican government to act against fentanyl production and fentanyl traffic. And the Mexican response has ranged from denying that any fentanyl is produced in Mexico. That was a gig that President López Obrador went on spring of 2023. All of a sudden started claiming there is no fentanyl cooked here and no fentanyl used in Mexico, both of which are lies. At other times, the Mexican government has brought down some labs. But several investigative reports by Reuters have shown that there is massive disinformation in the information that the Mexican government puts out, that not only is fentanyl as well as meth cooked in Mexico, but the Mexican government is cooking the books about the labs they actually take down.
And what
finally...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
There's one other element to the response, and that is that under U.S. pressure, every so often the Mexican government has tried to arrest a so-called high-value target in Mexico. Most significantly, this was the arrest of one of the sons of El Chapo, the most notorious trafficker in the world. The name of the son is Ovidio Guzman. So Ovidio was arrested in January of 2023.
And you talk about U.S. pressure on the Mexican government. It has also tried to pressure China to curb the production of the chemicals, the 3 chemicals used to make illicit fentanyl. Is that working? And is that a significant development in this crisis?
So trying to get China to crack down on the flow of precursor chemicals from China to the Mexican cartels is one element of the U.S. strategy with China. There are other aspects to it. The United States has also been trying to persuade China to crack down on money laundering related to China. Chinese money laundering institutions networks are the primary to-go money launderers for the Mexican cartels, and they have very rapidly grown to the top of the world's money laundering networks. There are other elements to it, but trying to regulate precursor chemicals has been one important component. In August 2024, China finally moved to so-called schedule to put on strict regulatory measures 3 precursors for fentanyl that are not known to have legal uses. This is part of a resurrected cooperation between China and the United States that was agreed by President Xi and President Biden in their San Francisco summit in November 2023. For about 2 years before that, we had zero willingness on the part of China to cooperate at all with the United States in counter-narcotics broadly, and fentanyl specifically, and also in other law enforcement activities. So China has moved to schedule these 3 precursors. It has done other things that are important. It also has put restrictions on xylazine. That's an animal tranquilizer that is being increasingly mixed into fentanyl and other drugs in the United States, a very bad development causing high morbidity as well as upping mortality. And it has regulated also nitazines, which are another type of synthetic opioids that are being shipped from China to Europe. What really matters is whether China will then follow these regulations with actual enforcement, whether it will move toward arresting and dismantling the networks that violate the rules around the production, sales, exports of these chemicals. This is really by far the most important element of controlling precursor chemicals. And that yet remains to be seen. In fact, China has been steadily messaging yes, we will put these tighter restrictions. We will tell producers that these tighter restrictions are in place, but do not expect arrests and prosecutions out of us.
So all of that considered, how optimistic are you that this crisis can be contained or controlled?
Well, unfortunately, the cat's out of the bag in North America. It is very difficult to imagine a scenario where fentanyl would stop being produced somewhere and trafficked into United States, Mexico, where there is also an increasing use, as well as Canada. In those places where synthetic opioids have already taken over the drug markets, law enforcement efforts need to focus on trying to minimize the harms associated with these markets, such as violence, such as corruptions. Obviously, restricting supplies would be great, but it will likely remain very elusive. It is very important to try to prevent people who develop substance use disorder who are exposed to opioids. So prevention has often struggled, but it's more important than ever. And crucially, people who do use drugs and develop substance use disorder need to be able to access effective treatment, as well as be able to avail themselves of harm reduction approaches. And a place like British Columbia is probably the place in the world with the most expansive and expensive, but most well-funded harm reduction approaches, yet it has tremendous fentanyl overdose rates. Mm-hmm. And that just tells us that harm reduction alone is not enough. In other markets where synthetic opioids are just starting to come in, such as Australia, such as Europe, UK, which is dealing with several outbreaks of nitazines, there may be a possibility that law enforcement could prevent those markets to expand. That requires a lot of diligence and adroitness. It requires cracking down on the initial supply, heavily prosecuting, heavily punishing the early movers into those markets there. But I'm afraid that even there, it's now too late. Globally, there is a synthetic drugs revolution, and the most advantageous synthetic drugs for traffickers are synthetic opioids.
It's such a troubling and complicated issue, and I'm grateful that you were able to guide us through it today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Vonda Felbab-Brown is a senior fellow in the Strobe Talbot Center for Security Strategy and Technology at the Brookings Institution. We reached her in Washington, D.C.